You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news in our industry with a group of biotech insiders. I'm Chris Garabedian, and my co hosts today are Tim Opler, Bruce Booth, and Sam Fazeli. For more information about our hosts and guest speakers, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. Um, let's start. We know after each month, right, we get kind of an overview of how the markets are doing. Everybody looks at kind of performance of the hedge funds and kind of the XBI, et cetera. And February was not a great month for specialty investors, and we're approaching the end of March. So let's just talk about kind of the state of the markets right now. Tim, why don't you kick us off?
Yep. So while we're speaking at the moment, the XB, I'm looking at my screen, is at 84.45. So it's actually down 4% this week. Uh, for whatever reason, biotech just has not been performing well this year. And I think if you talk to people about like what's going on, you'd hear two things. The first is that there's just been tremendous uncertainty about the Trump administration and what their intentions are and what it all means for the economy and for the biotech ecosystem specifically. The second thing going on is I think it's pretty clear that there are certain funds that are struggling to keep their LPs in line. And yesterday, I spoke to two different fund managers who both, cited rumors but no specific information that certain funds are sort of in forced selling mode. It sure feels that way, right? So, like the actual fundamentals right now are not that bad. In fact, I would say they're pretty positive. And yet, the desire of people at the margin to buy biotech has not been good. And I think, there's nothing different about the market today than a year ago or 5 years ago, fundamentally. Like we still have lots of great innovation. We have lots of good management teams. So it's easy to point to, zombie companies, companies that waste money. There's all sorts of reasons to not want to invest in the sector, but there's also a lot of good reasons to invest in the sector. Those haven't changed. So it's really the macro, I would say, external factors that are accounting for where we are at the moment.
Yeah, we're going to touch on both the public markets and the private markets, and I want to go to Bruce in a minute. But do you think the hedge funds, the outflows, right, is this much a function of, you've got LPs who invest in a lot of different sectors, and they've just been looking at the last 4 years and kind of sluggish, or non-returns. Even if a specific hedge fund might be overperforming, right, the XBI or other, sector indices, they are looking at this versus other sectors, and so it's the outflows really. Even if within our circle, you might have a hedge fund that's overperforming. Is that one of the phenomenons that's going on?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that I've heard. The first is that the endowments, the university funds, the large sovereign funds that are behind so many of the hedge funds in our industry are in general not that optimistic about the prospective returns, and that's driven, I think, largely by fears of what the Trump administration might do. I did speak
Yep.
to one fund manager that got very specific, and I was worried, like, are you just spreading rumors? Or are you saying something that's true? This was the guy who told me Armistice was in trouble, 6 weeks before it showed up in the Wall Street Journal. So he was right. Doesn't mean he's right this time, but what he was saying this morning is that there's a couple of funds that have been really strong performers over the last couple of years. So, some of these hedge funds, while everyone else is kind of hovering around the average, like are just, doing really well. And there's a couple funds that have significantly underperformed this year. They essentially went long the market and ended up being wrong. And so those guys are getting hit with requests from their LPs to take money out. And so as those guys are liquidating, and it sure felt like this week people were liquidating, as those guys are liquidating, there's just not enough buyers in the market to absorb that flow.
Yeah. So, Bruce, I'd like to go to you first. I want to do a shout out. You did a nice interview on the state of the markets with Brad Lonkar for Biotech TV. You were on a panel at Mass Bio this year. From the venture side, and you've got quite a portfolio across kind of the spectrum of maturity of clinical stage, preclinical. How are you viewing the current market dynamics and any Any perspectives on where we go over the
Yeah.
next 6 months?
Yeah. No, thanks for thanks for asking me that. Let me make a couple comments on Tim's remarks, which I fully agree with, and then I'll comment a little on the venture side. I just looked at the last 5 year, returns in the XBI, even 10 years, and it's amazing. The S&P has outperformed by like 10,000 basis points. It is just remarkable. And most of that is because, as we peaked in February of 21 and dropped, the S&P has been on a tear the last couple of years. And so if you're a mutual fund or you're being benchmarked to the S&P or to any particular non-biotech sector, whatever biotech allocation you have has been a drag on your returns. And so you're seeing a lot of folks shifting their allocations to make sure, for the prior 10 years, if you weren't equal market biotech or overweighted biotech, you generally underperformed your index. I think that has a lot to do with where we are. Chris, you mentioned zombies and people pointing at zombies and saying how horrible IPO performance has been. Makes me think about 15 or 20 years ago. In fact, I think it was the New York Times, it might have been the Wall Street Journal that coined the phrase zombie biotechs when they were talking about these IPOs from 1991 that in 2010 were essentially trading at or below their IPO prices, but were still around. And this idea that, in the public market, some of these zombies can live forever, this is not new. The IPO class of 2005, 6, 7, they were almost universally trading below their IPO prices within a few short months of their IPOs. And certainly by the end of the decade, the vast majority of them were under their IPO prices. And so this is not, it is not out of the normal cycles that we face. And I think Tim is exactly right. There are a lot of great teams. There are a lot of great innovative assets out there today. And so there are reasons to be, optimistic, but it does feel pretty bad, you know, right before the darkest hour of the night, right? So it doesn't feel great out in the marketplace today. On the venture side, I would say, and we primarily focus on the very earliest stages of venture creation, and we're going to start the same number of companies that we've started the last handful of years. um, but it is interesting to look at some of the numbers, and I had a chance to peek at what the first quarter looks like in terms of new first financings of biotech companies, so a good proxy for sort of startup venture creation. Back in 18 and 19, there were roughly 100 brand new companies getting financed for the first time each quarter. That spiked to about 180 at the peak of the bubble in 2021 for that first quarter. It's at 50 right now, a little bit above 50. Maybe when all the data comes in, it'll end at 70 or something like that. But this is a far cry, a 60, 65, 70% reduction from where we were, in 21, and well below where we were if you consider 17, 18, 19 as some sort of pre-pandemic normal. And so there has been a huge contraction in the number of new companies getting formed. Um, I would highlight that when those contractions happen, it's actually a great time to start companies. I mentioned in the Biotech TV interview, Nimbus was started in the bottom of the market in, spring of 2009. Chimera was started when the markets were a mess in 2015 and 16. You know, this is a great time to start new innovative companies if you can build them with discipline and capital efficiency.
Yeah, Bruce. So help me. You've been attributed to Booth's law, which was, really held true when the bullish markets came. It wasn't necessarily that there were a lot more companies established, but you would be seeing more money going in to those first financings or to those companies that are started. Now we're at a point where we have probably more venture, biotech dry powder than we've ever had. Help us square the circle of, like, we already know the phenomenon of more money going to proven management teams, but when you see a contraction of the new companies that are created, not necessarily Atlas but across the sector, but yet you have all of this money that ultimately has to be deployed. Where is that money going, or where's it going to go? Are we going to see more of the series B's, series C's, series E's with
Yeah.
that money? Just help us understand that.
Yeah, look, I think it's a great question. Right now, I think there are a lot of folks sitting on their hands. I mean, if you do look at quarterly outflows from venture firms into biotechs, it's running at about 5 billion. and it's still at 5 billion. It peaked during the bubble, but 5 billion, way more than we were 10 years ago. And so it's clear that there are a handful of companies raising lots and lots of money, and that is part of what we're driving. I think I commented on it at the end of last year that the skew between the median and the average is the largest I've ever seen it. Having looked at that measure of sort of the distribution towards the haves relative to the have-nots is massive. So we're definitely seeing that. I do think the Series B, C, D folks, you're seeing a lot of capitulation finally on price, and you're going to see, Series B's repricing A's and D's repricing, these companies, because it's been a challenging place to raise money, and B, you have a constrained, and a bottleneck around getting public, and so this huge backlog of companies that would much rather be raising public equity are stuck raising private rounds.
Yeah, I want to come back, Tim, to the public markets. And there's been a lot of chatter. Daphne Zohar had posted some data that a bank compiled, not to be named bank, of kind of the pipes and, the registered directs and the kind of wall crossed, pipes. And then Stat did an article that was kind of a retrospective of a year ago. The pipes were in the news because you would see, confidential information shared with kind of insider biotechs to do a pipe, and then a week or 2 or 3 weeks later, right, the data comes out. They're locked up, of course, and they get a deal. But now the retrospective on the performance is middling, right? I mean, it outperforms the XBI, maybe more performs the small mid cap, a bucket of, but it's not been a kind of a boon, right, to the investment strategies for these funds. So, any thoughts about the pipe phenomenon? And there was a take that I think also Daphne posted this. There was a Substack that she said it was a dark take on the industry, but one of the key themes there was that because of this insiderish phenomenon of pipes, it's moving the generalists further away because they're looking at it as, hey, this is just an insider's game, right? I don't want to touch it, right? I don't like how, we're seeing these deals, come together as one reason that, people are not, comfortable coming back into the sector. But any thoughts on this pipe if you were able to read the stat article or see some of the chatter?
Chris, it's a great question. I did see Daphne's post. I didn't read the stat article, and I'll give a point of view in a moment. But I did want to make a comment on Bruce's remarks, which are I had posted some data in our weekly last week from Deal Forma. And so, Bruce, indeed, the number of just venture rounds that are happening this year on an annualized basis is down quite significantly versus 2 or 3 years ago, and it's certainly down from last year as well. And then the average amount raised per venture round this year is 65 million. Last year that was 56 million. The year before that it was 46 million. So you're seeing a dramatic increase in concentration of investment. And I looked at that and I said, I bet you that's just like Bain and Arch. So I took those guys out of the data set, and it wasn't. It's the whole industry is essentially concentrating their bets into fewer and fewer companies. And on the pipe question, I saw Daphne's post. I mean, I thought it was really interesting. I had never run those kind of data myself, and so what she showed was that most of the money that the funds are making are between the moment that they receive confidential information and then the moment at which that confidential information is released to the public. And obviously, that can't make anyone feel good, right? Because it does feel like, let's call it legal insider trading, right? You're getting a peek at data. You get to essentially be induced to buy a stock at a price that's a little bit too low. And then what her data showed was that there was very little money that was made after that. And so most of the alpha from doing these pipes comes from the information that you gain. And it kind of, that sort of feels right. It's not great. And just to repeat, I think, sometime in the last 6 to 9 months, we had this debate in Biotech Hangout. And, the pro for doing these pipes is it's a necessary evil. It's a way that companies can get money in. And right now, getting money in is really important. If you're a CEO of a biotech company, ideally you'd have at least 3 years of cash. So many do not have that. We're in this down market where things are really tough. So The price of poker is you got to show some leg. Well, then you got to show some leg. And so I'm not the one to say that what's going on is wrong or irrational, but it was a very revealing post that she had.
Yeah, and well, Stat did a good job of just highlighting an example of where the pipe worked and one where it didn't work. And what was interesting to me is that when you look at the mean, there was a positive, right, gain, for all those pipe investments. But if you looked at the median, it was negative. So like 2/3 of the pipes didn't work out. Now this has been a tough tape, and somebody. I can't remember, but this was also posted, I think, on Biotech Hangout, where they looked at um, from 5 million to 2 billion, so SMID cap biotechs that were publicly traded, and looked at enterprise value and stock return, and it was really depressing, and it was over the last year. So we're not talking about the last 4 years, just the last year, which just for me emphasized that we are still in a challenged environment. And so again, I agree with
Yep.
Bruce that there's a lot of reason for optimism. I've been wrong multiple times of predicting that post-election, right, we'd see uncertainty leave. So we'll have to kind of see how. I think interest rates have a big part of it, and I think administration changes. So let's pivot to that. We
Yep.
had approvals for Makary for FDA, Bhattacharya for HHS, announced cuts. One of the first points of order, a lot of turnover and change in the administrative ranks. That's somewhat not too surprising. It's kind of like when you get a new CEO, that's orchestrating a kind of a new vision for a company. We don't usually follow which, VPs and directors and, SVPs are switched out for, new management. But that's what's happening. And clearly, as we've talked about, I think Brad Lonkar coined this, we have the establishment crew is being replaced by the anti-establishment crew. And that's, definitely in full force. And, a lot of debate on whether this can work or if it's going to do more damage than good, with all these departures and discontinuity. The one thing I'll say is FDA, it seems that they have protected the division reviewers and are focusing on the cuts that I think were about 25% to 30 to a third of the HHS cuts, so about 2,500 or so cuts to the FDA, but they're apparently saying that's not going to touch the reviewers. So it should, they're signaling that it's not going to disrupt PDUFA, but that's a debate. So anyway, Tim, let me go to you. Any thoughts about what's been happening every week? There's kind of new change and turnover here. What are your latest thinking?
Yeah, I mean, let's just talk about the facts. So 10,000 cuts from HHS. There's also 10,000 voluntary retirements at HHS. So according to what's been put out there, there were 82,000 people. So that implies 62,000 people at HHS. And then they've actually been pretty open in the Trump administration about where they're hitting. So they're going hard after FDA, CDC, and NIH. So more than 2/3 of the cuts are coming out of those three organizations, which are far from the majority of the area. In the FDA, so just to give you some statistics, which I looked up, in 2019, the FDA had 19,000 employees. At the beginning of 2024, the FDA had 19,700 employees. With the voluntary reductions, and they haven't told us how many of those voluntary reductions came out of FDA. I know so many people that have left FDA, so let's suppose that it was 3,000 and an extra 3,500. So that means the FDA is going from 19,700 people to 12,200 people. That's a huge reduction. And then if you say you're protecting your reviewers, where's the rest of that going to come? Well, the FDA inspects all of the plants around the world that make drugs. The FDA inspects food supplies. The FDA is involved in tobacco regulation. I mean, it's not like there's like this one division of people twiddling their thumbs. So somewhere along the way, there's going to be a significant change in the number of personnel. How that maps into the actual effectiveness of FDA, I have no insight, but it doesn't sound good from where I sit.
Yeah, well, and again, I just read a little bit about the areas that they are cutting, but it doesn't address the voluntary right departures. So you could be absolutely right, but it was more on the policy, administration, communications, right, HR, that kind of all I would call back office and less on the front lines. But again, these people have important jobs, so it's not to suggest that that's those are easy cuts. But yeah, will be definitely interesting. Bruce, I want to just come back to you. How do you, as a venture investor, view this? Have you gotten any insights recently that you're willing to share about just is FDA in working order from your portfolio companies? I'll just share we've had a little bit of a conservative stance, and we're trying to figure out if that's division related, if it's because of newer reviewers who are being overly cautious, right? If this is a real trend or not. But just any thoughts on the venture side as it relates to FDA?
Yeah, look, I'd say on a practical level of the 50 or so portfolio companies we have, everybody interacts with the FDA to some degree. Over the last 4 or 5 months, since the election, we haven't seen any material change in FDA's ability to interact with us and provide feedback and, work collaboratively. That said, that was before the news of the couple days ago where a huge number of people are going to leave. So that does, and they said they were going to protect reviewers, which is of course great for companies that are engaged with reviewers. But I'm with Tim. That's a huge percent reduction in what the FDA's mandate is supposed to be. So it's hard to imagine that it won't have real consequences on timelines, quality of engagement, the type of interactions we need to be able to bring innovative medicines forward. So it's definitely concerning. I haven't had enough time in the last 48 hours to really process the magnitude of those changes and what it means.
Yep.
And
Right.
Bruce, just to jump in, we're sitting here at a moment when the first time the U.S. is facing real competition in drug discovery and development from China. I can assure you that the Chinese FDA isn't reducing their staff by a third right now, right? I mean, this is the time in China where they're investing in their pharmaceutical infrastructure. And my gut instinct is, if anything, we want to make it easier for the FDA to do its job, not more difficult.
Yeah, no, Tim, I agree with that. What is interesting, the FDA as a gold standard regulatory organization holds a pretty high bar. When I think about generating that early human data, most of our companies, the vast majority, do not start their clinical work in the United States. We start work in Australia, we start work in Europe, we start work in the UK, because those regulatory agencies are more collaborative very early on and enable us to get to clinical data faster. China today, their FDA is working aggressively to allow Chinese companies to get to patients really fast and generate those early data packages that are so accretive from a value creation perspective, reducing their cost of capital, allowing them to do partnerships with pharma companies or allowing them to spin out assets into venture-backed companies. But the FDA is generally a much harder regulatory organization. So I don't know if this is going to be the case with the new administration and where that bar goes, but I think it is instructive to think about the comparative regulatory posture towards early clinical testing. The FDA has been the toughest group in the world for that, for sure.
Yeah, and Bruce, I have to echo that with our portfolio companies too. And we almost always, if we try to move through pre-IND, right, with FDA to do a SAD MAD in the US, we're almost in parallel, always ready to pivot, because as soon as you run into a conservative stance or they don't let you dose escalate, even if you're not on clinical hold, it really can be a challenge. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely room for improvement. And that maybe the wishful thinking is that they realize that we need to be more competitive, and McCary says we need to make it easier to do early safety studies and get into patients sooner in the US. So really great comments. Let's move on to some of the other topics at hand. Sam, you are covering European Lung Cancer Conference. A lot of updates across industry. You want to start with that?
Yes, yes, I do. But do you mind if I just make a very quick
Please
comment on
do.
this whole
Yes.
conversation you guys had? I've brought up on my Bloomberg screen the 5 years, as Bruce highlighted. S&P Nasdaq Biotech and XBI. And in the past, let's say, month and a bit, both the S&P and the Nasdaq Biotech are down. Nasdaq Biotech down about 14%. Sorry, not Biotech, Nasdaq 100, and S&P down about 8%. And our sector, of course, the XBI has kind of dwindled down. There wasn't one big drop. So here's the question I think a lot of people would ask themselves is, having seen the performance of the XBI over the past, or the sector, let's say, over the past 5 years, where, if I have money today, where would I put it? Would I go to buy the bottom or the next low point that I'm happy with when it comes to the Nasdaq listed stocks or the S&P listed 500 listed type of stocks, or do I want to put it in biotech? I think if we just keep it as simple as that, added to what you guys just said about a generalist sitting there looking at all these pipe deals, thinking, well, I get a clear signal here that I shouldn't be playing because this is obviously something that needs wall crossing to understand. I think that's part of the issue. It's so much easier just to go into another cash flow, a low point of a cash flow generating company, than try and figure out what biotech to buy. Um, and I don't know how you come out of this dark night. How long is this dark night? I've no idea. It's very hard. I think every time we've tried to do it, we've burnt our fingers. So I just thought I'd add that. It's not exactly a positive comment,
Yeah,
but
but
there you go.
an important comment. But
Uh,
Sam, why don't we go to the cancer conference?
Yeah. So we have two things that I want to touch on. One is the battle that's going on between Johnson and Johnson and AstraZeneca. As you all know, AstraZeneca has one of the leading drugs in the treatment of EGFR, but the leading drug in the treatment of EGFR positive lung cancer, and that's called Tagrisso, which I think when it succeeded, I've heard some companies had some EGFR inhibitors in development, decided no point carrying on. We can't possibly beat this. And if we do, it will be just by a margin. So Tagrisso is the standard of care for treating non-small cell lung cancer which is driven by EGFR mutations. And so, of course, some others have wanted to play here. And I think Johnson and Johnson is now trying to set a claim that it is the new standard of care. And this is not the first time. We've had data earlier on. It was World Congress of Lung Cancer about a year and a half ago. And it's quite important because Astra's sitting there with this being one of their biggest drugs. And of course, that makes it super important to the continued ability of the company to generate the cash it needs for the significant R&D investments that it's making. So J&J is coming at it for a different perspective. They say, okay, well, we have a combination antibody drug, which is Rybrevant, a c-Met targeting antibody. You could call it bispecific if you want, and something that is similar to Tagrisso, a TKI that inhibits EGFR. And so, of course, you've got the issue that you've got an extra mechanism of action. And that clearly does give you some benefit. It gives you a benefit on progression-free survival. It gives you about a year extra on overall survival. So the question is, but why isn't this going to be the standard of care going forward? And of course, it's side effects. Side effects is one of the main issues. And some of those side effect issues can be dealt with by switching to subcutaneous Rybrevant from IV, which of course is very helpful because the drug you're competing with is just a daily oral drug in Tagrisso. And what they need to do is so the subcutaneous switch is going to address some of the side effect profiles. The one that's troublesome is the skin disorders that it causes, and that's something that I think the company has to continue to work on. And I heard from my colleague who's there that a special session on this was specifically focused on that. And which of course suggests that even they see it as a major issue to deal with. And of course, the other angle is that AstraZeneca isn't sitting still. They've got data for Tagrisso plus chemo, which of course then takes you into chemo IV, but that also is likely, in our view, to probably match the survival benefit of the Rybrevant or the data that J&J is providing. And there's another element thereafter, and that's a combination strategy that they're going into, which is a c-Met, an oral c-Met inhibitor that they've got partnered from China's HUTCHMED, which has been in development for a while. And that's showing very, very decent, very exciting deep waterfall plots in terms of response rates, etc. So that's why we think anyone who writes an article saying, "Yep, here we go, Johnson and Johnson's claiming the crown," I think we need to see how physicians actually do this. So that was one that was mostly reported, and of course the other one is BioNTech. It was a relatively highly anticipated update from them. Two posters, both of them in small cell lung cancer, not non-small, small cell lung cancer, and it is for one of these VEGF bispecifics. So it's their VEGF bispecific, which is BNT327. It's a PDL1 VEGF, as unlike Summit and Akesos, which is a PD1 VEGF. So there are some differences there, and you could argue one better than the other. Clinical data will show. In second line, I think there was some folks who didn't really like what I would say a decline in the overall response rate that we saw from what people had expected, which was around the 60% before, to down to 42%. So I think, given what I've heard from a few clients, that's something that unnerved folks. But we believe that in second line, the change that happened between that first readout of around 60% to this now readout of 42% is the fact that they started recruiting more pre-treated patients. So if you're treatment naive, you're more likely to give a better response than compared to a IO naive, than one that has had IO before. So that's what we believe has been the driver of this drop in overall response rates. Nevertheless, the second line data that we've seen in terms of median OS, median PFS, ORR, and DCR still looks pretty decent to us. And then, of course, there was the update on first line. And in first line, again, I just saw an endpoints article calling it a potential win. It does look good compared to the current products that are on the market, either the ones that contain an immune checkpoint inhibitor or the ones in Delta, which is from Amgen. But there's one thing that I don't like, and that is the spider plot that we've seen in the poster. There are lots of patients who are progressing really quickly early on, 2 months, 4 months after the start of therapy. So, but the spider plot looks really nice to start with. It's just that you don't like seeing all those things that arrows or lines that start jumping back up again. Other than that, it's really good data and really promising. And I believe that it supports them going into a phase 3, which I think they're either in or about to go in for first line small cell lung cancer. And of course, opportunity here for combinations. I think the company is thinking about B7H3 and their own TROP2 inhibitor, bispecific or ADC, sorry. And so there's quite a lot of opportunity here to do better. And these were the two data sets that I thought were worth
Great.
looking
Yeah.
at ELCC.
Look, very important. With one of the big four cancers, lung is one of those that is a little more elusive to generate good data sets. And, many drugs have failed in lung where they've actually succeeded in other cancers. And so an important meeting to really differentiate who are the, winners, losers, how are these new drugs being positioned. Now, Sam, I'm going to come to you in a minute on the obesity space because there was a big deal with a China-based biotech. But before we do that, Tim, I know we started the hour with saying you're working on a China report, and I think you visited there recently. Would love to, before we go into that deal with a China-based biotech, give us your perspective on, there's been a lot talked about over recent months and the last year about, where's China in our ecosystem and how is it influencing what's happening in U.S. investment. But what are some of the early insights that you're seeing?
Yep. So just a couple things that are a little bit new on China. The first is, I mean, as is, I think, pretty clear from the news, there's a lot of China cross-border deals this year. And so Chris from Deal Pharma sent me the latest data this week. So he and I sort of reported in January that 31% of all large pharma molecules last year were from China, and that wasn't a surprise to me, but it did appear to be a surprise to a lot of folks in our industry because that stat caused a lot of buzz. So this year, the number is 41%. And if you look at the dollars, in other words, upfront dollars, it's even higher. So China is becoming ever more important. I spent a week in China, not last week, but the week before that. And it was a eye-opening experience. I had just been there in November of 2024. So it's only a 4-month difference. And it was as if the country had changed a lot in just 4 months. And maybe to highlight, 2 or 3 years ago, all of a sudden the Chinese started to matter in ADCs and bispecifics. But we all sort of said to ourselves, well, you don't have to worry. They're not going to get into, the new stuff. Like whatever Bruce Booth's starting a company around right now is probably not facing a lot of Chinese competition. Chris, probably the same is true for you. So I was very struck by just some of the conversations about the new codes that are being formed by Chinese VCs. So, for example, one of the hottest areas right now in the US would be IgG extracellular degraders, so-called ASPGR degraders. So I met with one Chinese investor and company, and the guy was making several very valid points about weaknesses of those ASPGR degraders. And he said, so we've been thinking about this really hard, and this is what we're going to do. And so he spelled out a strategy to essentially overcome the weaknesses of those strategies. So, all of a sudden, this is like an emerging technology area where a Chinese company is going to be out in front. I would say that I had in 1 week 5 or 6 conversations like that. So, for example, another kind of like holy grail topic in our industry is getting rid of HIV, right? So, a functional cure for HIV is something we've all been looking for a long time. I think a number of people have been sort of saying for a while that, maybe CAR T is the way to go. So I just met this Chinese scientist and he says, well, everyone's been saying CAR T is the way to go, but let me tell you why it's not going to work. And so he went through all the technical problems with CAR T achieving a functional cure for HIV. And the problem is that these cells that have the virus become quiescent. They're very hard to hunt down. And so he
Yeah.
described an in vivo approach to do it using in vivo cell therapy and started to show me data that, he's doing it. And I was just like, wow, I mean, that is just so awesome. And it's coming out of Hangzhou, China. I visited Hangzhou. It was so exciting. This is the city that came up with DeepSeek, and the number of brand new tall buildings that have been put up for new ventures. It looked just like Kendall Square, to be candid, and maybe better. And I just met entrepreneur after entrepreneur who was energized, and they were talking first-in-class innovation on this trip, not, hey, I'm going to be a lot better at doing, Joe Blow's bispecific. So it was a very interesting trip.
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit of the when you have competition like that, whether, in the US we joke a lot about the Bay Area and Boston, Cambridge, or, the second player, the Avis versus the Hertz is always like chomping at the bit to do a better job. And it feels like that's happening on a global scale, right, with China. And Bruce said it earlier with, regulatory agencies, right? Like there's a lot of ways that they can move levers to gain competition. Bruce, let me quickly ask you, has it changed how you think about company creation, knowing there's a lot of available drugs in China that might be better characterized, might be able to be licensed, versus working with a US company? How has this influenced the way you guys think about things?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you're a venture investor today and you're not thinking about China and sourcing innovation from China in some way, shape, or form, you're missing the ball. As Tim said, the place is transforming, and as a global source of innovation, it's going to be an important contributor. So we have to acknowledge that, embrace that, rise to the challenge. And so whether you're starting companies out of those assets, we've done a few of those, or you're in licensing some of them into existing portfolio companies, it's going to be important. I would say innovation has lots of forms, and innovation around molecule origination is one piece. But then how do you think about developing it? How do you think about the translational medicine approaches, the early development approaches? There's lots to innovate around, where I think the talent pool in the US is particularly well equipped for being able to do. So I see it as more of an opportunity. I do think for companies that are working on new things today, the whole um, the whole way you disclose what you're working on, I think will change, where companies will keep a lot more as confidential trade secrets. There'll be less early filings. Typically, biotechs try to file patents early as a way to say, hey, I have an issue patent, that'll help me raise money. I think there's going to be a lot more behind the scenes, confidential, undisclosed, and you're going to wait until the last moment where you
Yep.
might be back in the clinic and dosing before you disclose the targets you're working on and the things you're doing. So I do think, in general, that lack of transparency around what folks are doing is a bad thing in the global sense, but it's going to be an important way for companies to protect themselves from super fast followers showing up in China quite quickly.
Yeah, no one's gonna bet against a China fast follower strategy. So you want to go as far as you can. Well said. Sam, let's come back to you. So obesity still in the news. Deal making. Two deals that would love for you to cover.
Yeah, sure, Chris. Of course, one of them is with the China biotechs. But if you permit, one of the things that China has suffered from in the AI race, DeepSeek aside, is their lack of access to the NVIDIA type chips. And of course, for that, if you wanted to make them yourself, you need an access to the sort of machines that ASML produces, the double-decker bus-sized lithography equipment, and there aren't pretty much nobody else can make those because of the detail that you need to think about when it comes to the lithography part of it. So here they have no barrier. The barrier here is how many people do you have and how much money do you throw at it and how good are your scientists. So I think, as I've thought for the past 10, 15 years, I've been going on about China and having gone to China, I think they're doing an amazing job. And I'm pretty sure that the output of research from there and publications and funding is just going to continue to get pretty close to what the US does, especially if the US starts entrenching a little bit. On that front, Novo Nordisk did two deals this week, which is interesting because they're both in obesity, which is you would have thought they've got everything they possibly need in obesity. But one thing that they've got is the deal they did with United Laboratories for UBT251, which is just completed phase 1 for ex-China rights, basically. And what this deal involved was a $200 million upfront and up to $2 billion in terms of total contingencies, etc., or milestones. And it's a tri-agonist. From what I understand, it's in one molecule, GLP-1, GIP, glucagon. So it's similar to Eli Lilly's retatrutide. Now, Nova has something like this, but we don't really know the detail of exactly what the three elements are. It might be GLP-1, GIP, amylin, or whatever, or it might be I don't know exactly whether they've ever disclosed whether it's three molecules, separate three molecules, or one molecule in terms of one large peptide of 40, 50 amino acids or 55 amino acids. So the deal is the company's got data, and the data is 16.6% weight loss, which at 12 weeks, which is pretty much in line with what we've seen from competitors. It's an injectable, of course, so it does look like it just gives Novo a quicker access to this triple agonist world if they want to go down this road. Now, Lilly is in phase 3 with retatrutide, which we should start seeing data for this starting late 2025. So they're a little bit behind, but honestly, this is such a fast moving. It's almost as fast moving as AI in the obesity world. So in terms of the snakes and ladders that we're going to see here. Now, one thing I just want to keep reminding everyone, Lilly CEO Dave Ricks, I loved the phrase he used once. He said, look, if you have the same mechanisms, you're going to get the same efficacy. There's no magic here, I think the phrase he used. And I don't think there is any magic here. You might be working on the margins in terms of it is 16% or 17% or 15%, but they're all going to work. So the question is, how are you going to manufacture them, get them to patients, and to cut yourself a market share, which of course for Novo is not an issue, given they're one of the biggest players. Now, on the point of drugs in development, we've done a quick assessment. There are more than 100 drug makers that are after obesity, with 160 drugs in development. This is compared to 120 in the last time we looked at the analysis, which was in August last year. So, and over 40% of them are in phase 2, and a whole bunch of them come from China. And of course, when you look at the deals that were done in China, that includes Merck with Hansoh, AstraZeneca with Incogene, Novo United Labs now, and of course the Kylera, which I think we call what do they call them? It's not just a spin out, a newco. There you go. And the deal today that Novo Nordisk did is with actually a company that I hadn't forgotten about, but I'd given up on, and that's Lexicon Pharmaceuticals. Lexicon was in the game, or not the game, the running for SGLT2 drugs, which of course there are two significant ones on the market, one from Lilly and one from AstraZeneca. And they're oral drugs. They're for diabetes. They do give you some weight loss, mostly because of the reduced availability of calories in your bloodstream, because it promotes the secretion of glucose through your kidneys. And that does have some side effects that it brings with it. Their drug eventually got licensed to Sanofi, and Sanofi eventually gave it back and gave them $260 million. And so I'd forgotten about them. And then today, of course, this deal comes, $75 million from Novo Nordisk as an upfront for a preclinical asset. I think it's an acetyl CoA. Is that right? Here we go. It is a mechanism of action, is a ACSL5I inhibitor. So I have to really think about this because I haven't come across this mechanism before. We're digging into it a little bit more to get our head around what the opportunity is here. But it's got an effect on the feeling of fullness, and also an impact on energy expenditure, etc. So it's not exactly it's a completely novel mechanism, which is interesting in the portfolio. But $75 million for a preclinical asset sounds pretty punchy to me.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks for that, Sam. And actually, related to the obesity field, a subset of the obesity is a genetic rare disease called Prader-Willi. For the audience that's not familiar, and we just saw the first drug approved by Soleno. The drug's called Vycat XR. It's actually an old drug, but an extended release form of an old generic drug. The data was pretty compelling, but this is a stock company that was trading at $4 to $5 a share about 18 months ago, and today is trading over $70 a share. I think a lot of the kind of conventional wisdom was that they would get approved, but the stock still popped this past week on the approval. It's they've communicated the pricing. It looks like for its weight based dosing, and it looks like they're going to be about a $500,000 for the average weight of a patient with Prader-Willi, and their projected peak sales is about 2 billion. So, very interesting development for this company. Just shows you that there's companies that fly under the radar and that aren't getting the attention. And when they produce a data set that can get FDA approval, it can catalyze a company very quickly to billions of dollars of value. Prader-Willi is one of these where you mentioned appetite and suppressing the feeling of hunger. Well, this hyperphagia is the main characteristic of this, where they never feel full, so they're constantly eating, and they have a score, the hyperphagia questionnaire, used in clinical trials, and they showed a pretty extensive reduction, going from about 9+ points on the scale to less than 3 points on the scale, and a placebo adjusted difference of 5 points, which is in their label. And so they're approved. And that was a big, for those of us who've been in the rare disease. I know, Bruce, you've done a lot in the rare disease space. Many have attempted, many knew that this was an important population. It was nice to see the first approval. And also sticking with rare disease, Wave announced additional data with their exon 53 drug. and their plans for submitting to the FDA. The data, the most compelling piece of the data was they have a time to rise improvement of more than 3 seconds, which is significant. This is called the Gower maneuver, where they start at a sitting position on the floor and they time how quickly they can get up. They also had a lot of biomarkers that suggest, creatine kinase and fibrosis reduction on these biomarkers. They also hinted that they have other clinical data that's pointing in the right direction, including North Star and other measures. So they did say that the FDA is open or welcoming their submission. And like a lot of DMD companies, they're comparing to Sarepta's and other approved drugs for dystrophin as a biomarker to show that they're producing more dystrophin, and that they have some clinical outcomes to support that. Again, I know this well. It's a small study. So 11 patients treated. It was an open label, and they compared to historical controls. So again, it'll be interesting to see in this new FDA, do they go to advisory panel? Are they still open to these types of approvals on small data sets? Where is that sentiment around DMD? I'll just also add that exon skipping, this is the same mechanism and technology that the first three drugs for Sarepta were approved on. And with the recent death with Sarepta's gene therapy, it still looks like exon skipping has a place in the armamentarium for DMD. So those were updates there. Bruce, any comments on that? Just I know you guys look at a lot of rare disease and have invested in both of these, spaces, if I recall.
Yeah, no, that is true. We've invested across the board in those rare diseases, and it's great progress. I mean, it's Zafgen was one of our companies, did the first phase 3 study ever in Prader-Willi, and helped to validate that particular hyperphagia questionnaire. So it's nice to see some successes in that space for a community that's never had real medicines made for it. So it's awesome.
Absolutely. All right, Sam. There was some CG oncology data that was released this week. You want to cover that?
Yeah, yet another conference also in Europe, European Association of Urology. CG Oncology is in the world of treating bladder cancer. They have a drug that I'm going to call Creto. I'm not going to try and pronounce it here because every time I try, it doesn't work out. And it's basically a engineered, what they call engineered conditionally replicating oncolytic immunotherapy. It's delivered into the bladder, very similar to what folks do with BCG, and not that different to what's done with where the current excitement is, which is Johnson and Johnson's TAR 200, otherwise known as the pretzel, which is a tiny little, relatively tiny loop that's drug eluting. So that gets delivered into the, which has got a chemo in it, that gets delivered into the bladder and releases chemo. And it's shown really, really good data. And these guys are chasing the same kind of patient population, non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, because you don't want to go beyond the bladder into systemic because you can't deliver this systemically. 70% of new bladder cases are NMIBC. So what the data showed is that in their phase 3 trial, 112 patients, they had a pretty decent response, complete responses. Didn't quite get up to the numbers that we've seen with TAR 200, but definitely on the CR rates at 12 months. And CR is what people are after here because it's that's what you can get with these localized therapies. But there are differences in the background of the patients in terms of carcinoma in situ or papillary, etc. So that complicates the comparison. But to us, the data looked pretty decent, and their side effect profile looks a little bit better. So it really does position them in what I believe to be a competitive, at least from a data perspective. What would be nice is to see the further data from other cohorts of this trial, which is called Bond 003. And we'll look forward to seeing some of that. And it's also a good comparison for Protara Therapeutics Advanced 2 trial, which we'll be looking at as they report. The problem for all of these folks is who wants to go up against Johnson and Johnson? So they need meaningful partnerships, etc., to or to be bought out in the end for them to be able to compete. I'll leave it there,
Yeah,
Chris.
that's great. Tim, I'm going to come back to you. I'm always impressed with you and both you and Bruce in terms of your bandwidth to do analytics of data and really forge kind of new communications for our industry. I think you guys are really helping our audience and just the industry with kind of insights. You also recently participated in a history of aging report. You want to highlight what the learnings were there?
Yeah, and the difference between Bruce and I is I'm a former academic, and so my reports just go on forever and ever and ever, and he kind of gets to the point.
Yep.
So
Yep.
I put out a very lengthy report on aging, and just to give you like the 2 or 3 minute summary. So what we call pharmaceuticals began in 1620 through the work of Paracelsus. Paracelsus's main goal was to essentially achieve human immortality. If you look at what was called pharmaceuticals before that, which is really like things like herbal medicines and various forms of witchcraft, whatever, the main goal was to help humans achieve immortality. What we found is we've just kind of reviewed the history of work on aging. Is the really has been the principal objective of most thinkers about health and medicine, for many millennia. What's so fascinating is that today there are hundreds of thousands of research papers on aging science. And yet, if you look at the biotech industry, I would never, Chris, call you or Bruce conventional, but let's just call you guys mainstream investors. There are actually very few mainstream investments made in the field of aging. And that's because I think there's a widespread view that the science is not translationally ready. And so the current report that I put out was meant to just sort of show where the literature is now. And if you read the report, and it takes a while to read it because it is reasonably lengthy, what emerges is a sense of 3 therapeutic strategies that appear to have substantial validity. One of those strategies is to remove senescent cells. So senescent cells are cells that stop replicating. It turns out that they do lots of bad things. Another strategy is to reprogram cells to a younger phenotype, and that sounds like total science fiction until you read all the papers and you see it's possible. And a third strategy that's also very interesting is to actually replace cells. And so we've long had things like organ transplants, and so it's also possible to do cell transplants. And there's some work coming out of one lab at Stanford that would suggest that that's also a very viable strategy. And so it was just very interesting to kind of, trace the history of this field and why write this long report on aging. And the main point I'm trying to make is that this field is going to be translationally ready, and it will make everything else we work on in our field look small, right? It'll make even obesity look
Yeah.
like a very small indication. And I'm going to be putting out another report shortly that will sort of walk through how it all needs to play out for it to work. And I'm not telling anyone, like, hey, I've got this pill you can take, will make you live to 200, tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the science is moving very fast and in a very decisive and interesting way.
Yeah, look, I think Bruce would agree. The science usually precedes the ability to translate and develop drugs, and so sometimes we will be 100% agreement on the science of a field, but don't feel that it's ready to figure out the clinical regulatory pathway on a given technology. So even if you don't see a lot of investment in an area, many venture investors will not dismiss an emerging field like that. We're close to the hour, so let me just wrap by saying, hey, we're still seeing some wind downs. Lindra was a high profile, Bob Langer, delivery technology that got a lot of investing, and they announced their kind of wind down. They couldn't raise money for their schizophrenia pivotal trial. It seems we have other brand names like Encarta, Elevate that announced double digit layoffs. So we're still seeing the signs of challenges, and just a kind of a postscript on the 23andMe, which kind of the writing was on the wall, but they've officially declared bankruptcy. Couldn't find the buyer or the investor to come in, and Anne Wojcicki, the CEO, says she may still try to buy the company, but I don't know, that's a tough road if you couldn't find the investors when you were the CEO, now you come back and buy it. How is that going to change the story? And then just the last thing on that is the co-founder of 23andMe, and Linda Avey, posted on both LinkedIn and X the genesis of the company and her experience as CEO when she was replaced and kind of lessons learned. So it's worth a read to hear about, a very high profile brand that wasn't able to make it. But look, thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Biotech Hangout. Hope you enjoyed the dialogue. Any last comments, Tim, Bruce, Sam, to close us?
Nope.
None for me. Just great conversation. Thank you, Chris.
Yep.
Yep. Thank you. Have a great Friday.
Ditto.